Inside Leavenworth Prison, America's most infamous inmates and gang power. Leavenworth Prison occupies a singular place in American history. Long before the term supermax existed, the United States Penitentiary at Leavenworth stood as the federal government's ultimate instrument of confinement. It was not simply a prison, it was a message. To be sent to Leavenworth was to be marked as someone the system needed to control with absolute certainty. Located in Kansas, USP Leavenworth opened in 1903 and quickly became synonymous with federal authority. Over decades, it housed some of the most infamous inmates in the country, men whose crimes, influence, or reputations placed them beyond the reach of ordinary institutions. But Leavenworth's legacy is not defined only by the names that passed through its gates. It is defined by how power functioned inside its walls. This chapter explores Leavenworth as a closed ecosystem, where reputation outweighed force, gangs operated quietly, and survival depended on understanding rules that were never written down. A prison designed to project power. Leavenworth was built at a time when incarceration was meant to be unmistakable. Its massive stone walls, rigid layout, and militaristic design were intentional. This was not a place meant to rehabilitate quickly or comfort inmates. It was designed to command obedience and project permanence. From its earliest years, Leavenworth received inmates who challenged the system, organized crime figures, violent offenders, political radicals, and individuals considered disruptive wherever they were housed. The federal system used Leavenworth as a stabilizing force, sending its most difficult cases to a place where control was prioritized above all else. Over time, this practice shaped the prison's population. Leavenworth became a concentration point for influence. Infamy inside the walls. Inside Leavenworth, infamy did not come from newspaper headlines. It came from reputation among inmates. Some men arrived already known, individuals whose crimes or affiliations were recognized immediately. Others built reputations through discipline, patience, or an ability to navigate pressure without visible reaction. Reputation became currency. It dictated who spoke to you and who avoided you. Where you could sit. Whether you were tested, or left alone. In Leavenworth, losing reputation was more dangerous than never having it at all. Once a man was perceived as weak or unpredictable, recovery was rare. The quiet nature of gang power. Contrary to popular portrayals, gang power inside Leavenworth was rarely loud or chaotic. Open displays of dominance attracted attention, and attention threatened stability. Instead, gangs operated through subtle alignment and shared understanding. Leadership was often indirect. Orders were implied rather than spoken. Discipline was enforced quietly, often without witnesses. Race influenced alignment, but survival shaped loyalty. Temporary alliances formed when interests aligned. Conflicts were postponed when escalation threatened collective consequences. Leavenworth did not reward spectacle. It rewarded restraint. Violence as a tool, not an impulse. Leavenworth was not defined by constant violence. Its danger came from the opposite, restraint. When violence occurred, it was deliberate and targeted. It was meant to send a message, not cause disorder. A single incident could alter the balance of an entire housing unit. Uncontrolled aggression brought lockdowns, investigations, and transfers. These outcomes benefited no one inside. As a result, force was used sparingly. Silence carried more weight than chaos. The unwritten code. Daily life inside Leavenworth was governed by rules no policy manual contained. Do not draw unnecessary attention. Do not appear desperate for affiliation. Do not cross boundaries, spoken or implied. New inmates were observed closely. How they moved. How they spoke. How they reacted under pressure. Small behaviors mattered. Mistakes rarely produced immediate consequences. Instead, pressure accumulated quietly, through isolation, exclusion, or subtle intimidation. Survival required awareness, not aggression. Isolation and control. Segregation and control units were central to Leavenworth's management strategy. High-risk or disruptive inmates were removed from general population to limit influence. Sometimes this worked. Other times, isolation only refined power. Reputation continued to operate without proximity. Orders moved through intermediaries. Influence persisted through memory and expectation. For some inmates, isolation enhanced authority rather than diminishing it. The role of correctional staff. Correctional officers at Leavenworth were acutely aware of internal dynamics. Intelligence gathering was constant. Patterns were monitored. Alliances were tracked. But control was never absolute. Removing a powerful inmate could destabilize a unit. Leaving one in place could preserve order. Every decision carried risk. The institution functioned as a balancing act, maintaining order without provoking instability. The psychological cost of influence. Power inside Leavenworth came with constant scrutiny. Influential inmates were watched by staff and rivals alike. Every move carried consequences. Some attempted to fade into the background over time, reducing visibility to preserve safety. Others clung to authority long after it served them. Leavenworth did not reward pride. It punished those who failed to adapt. Aging and the end of power. No reputation lasted forever. As years passed, even the most infamous inmates aged. Physical strength declined. Health deteriorated. Outside connections weakened. Influence faded quietly. There were no confrontations or announcements, only absence. Conversations stopped. Deference disappeared. For some, this loss of relevance was harder to endure than confinement itself. Myth versus reality. Popular culture often portrays Leavenworth as chaotic and brutal. The reality was colder and more controlled. Its power came from predictability. From routine. From silence. Violence was rare but meaningful. Control was constant but subtle. Behavior adapted accordingly. Leavenworth did not need fear alone to function. It relied on understanding. Why Leavenworth still matters. Although Leavenworth no longer houses the most dangerous inmates in the federal system, its legacy remains influential. Many modern prison management strategies were refined here. Leavenworth demonstrated that power inside prison does not need to be loud. It only needs to be consistent. If Leavenworth Prison was built to contain power, it was also forced to coexist with it. By the time inmates arrived at this institution, many had already spent years, sometimes decades, navigating prison politics elsewhere. They did not enter Leavenworth unprepared. They arrived with experience, expectations, and an understanding that survival depended on influence more than force. This chapter examines how gang power and inmate networks actually operated inside Leavenworth, how control was established, how it was maintained, and why it rarely looked the way outsiders imagined. Power did not announce itself. Inside Leavenworth, power rarely spoke first. The most influential inmates were often the quietest. They did not posture, threaten, or seek attention. Their authority was assumed rather than displayed. Others deferred to them automatically, through seating choices, silence during disputes, or subtle shifts in behavior. These signs were nearly invisible to outsiders but unmistakable to those inside. Power moved through expectation, not command. The structure of gang influence. Gang networks at Leavenworth were not chaotic groups driven by impulse. They were structured systems shaped by long-term survival. Leadership was layered. Rarely did one individual issue direct orders. Instead, guidance moved through trusted intermediaries with responsibility deliberately blurred. This protected leaders from disciplinary consequences while maintaining control. Every member understood their role. Some enforced discipline. Some gathered information. Some simply existed as presence. Visibility was minimized. Stability was prioritized. Race, identity, and pragmatism. Race played a role in alignment, but it was not the sole factor. Survival required flexibility. Inmates learned quickly that rigid ideology could be dangerous. Temporary alliances formed when interests aligned. Hostilities were postponed when escalation threatened collective punishment. Leavenworth punished disorder indiscriminately. As a result, restraint became strategy. Gang loyalty was real, but it operated within practical limits. Survival outweighed symbolism. Communication without exposure. Direct communication was risky. Conversations were monitored. Movements tracked. Written material scrutinized. So influence adapted. Messages were implied rather than stated. Instructions were delivered through routine conversation, body language, or absence of response. Meaning existed between words. Those who understood the language survived. Those who didn't often misunderstood too late. Power did not need to be explained. Debt, obligation, and control. Debt was one of the most effective tools of influence inside Leavenworth. Debts were not always financial. They could be favors, protection, or silence. Repayment was expected, but rarely rushed. This delay created pressure. An unpaid obligation lingered in the background, shaping behavior. The threat was not immediate violence, it was uncertainty. The longer a debt existed, the heavier it became. Violence as enforcement, not emotion. When violence occurred, it served a function. It reinforced boundaries. It corrected violations. It reminded others of consequences. It was rarely emotional. Random aggression disrupted stability and drew attention. Calculated force preserved order. This distinction mattered. In Leavenworth, losing control was weakness. Maintaining restraint signaled authority. The role of fear without chaos. Fear existed, but it was controlled. Inmates did not fear constant attack. They feared being singled out. Being labeled unreliable. Being seen as unpredictable. That fear shaped behavior more effectively than violence ever could. It encouraged compliance without confrontation. Staff awareness and tactical tolerance. Correctional staff understood these dynamics. Intelligence gathering was constant. But intervention was measured. Breaking up every informal power structure was impossible, and often counterproductive. Removing a stabilizing figure could create chaos. As a result, some influence was tolerated, not endorsed, but managed. The goal was order, not elimination. This uneasy balance defined daily operations. Power vacuums and their consequences. When a powerful inmate was transferred or isolated, the effects were immediate. Others moved to fill the gap. Tensions rose. Alliances shifted. Power vacuums were dangerous moments. Staff monitored these transitions closely, knowing instability often followed disruption. Sometimes violence erupted. Sometimes restraint prevailed. Nothing was guaranteed. Isolation as a test of influence. Segregation tested authority. Some inmates lost relevance quickly when isolated. Their influence depended on proximity. Without access, it collapsed. Others retained power despite separation. Their reputations endured. Expectations remained. Decisions were deferred in their absence. Isolation did not determine influence, adaptability did. The slow erosion of control. Over time, even the strongest networks weakened. Members were transferred. Sentences ended. Loyalty faded. New inmates arrived without historical attachment. Influence required renewal. Those who adapted survived. Those who clung to old structures declined. Leavenworth did not preserve power. It challenged it continuously. Psychological strain behind authority. Maintaining influence was exhausting. Every interaction required calculation. Trust narrowed. Paranoia increased. One mistake could unravel years of positioning. Some inmates eventually stepped back, choosing safety over dominance. Others could not let go. Those who refused to adapt often paid the highest price, not immediately, but gradually. The quiet end of gang power. Gang power at Leavenworth rarely ended in confrontation. It faded. Conversations stopped. Requests went unanswered. Influence dissolved into irrelevance. This quiet erosion was more common than dramatic collapse. And for those who once commanded respect, it was often the hardest outcome to accept. At Leavenworth Prison, time is the most powerful force of all. Gangs rise and fall. Alliances shift. Reputations grow and collapse. But time moves in only one direction, and it does not negotiate. For inmates inside Leavenworth, survival was never just about navigating power in the present, it was about enduring long enough to watch that power change shape. This chapter explores how time reshaped life inside Leavenworth, how influence faded, and why even the most infamous inmates eventually confronted the same quiet reality. Time as an unavoidable equalizer. Inside Leavenworth, sentences were often long. Decades were common. For some inmates, release was theoretical rather than practical. At first, time moved slowly. New inmates counted days, then months. But eventually, years blurred together. Milestones lost meaning. Seasons repeated without distinction. Time changed priorities. Early in a sentence, reputation mattered most. Later, stability did. The longer an inmate remained inside, the more survival depended on minimizing risk rather than asserting dominance. Time rewarded restraint. Aging inside a place built for control. Leavenworth was not designed for aging inmates. It was built for containment. As inmates grew older, physical decline became unavoidable. Strength faded. Reflexes slowed. Chronic illness emerged. Injuries took longer to heal. Yet classification often remained unchanged. Men who once posed significant risk were still housed under strict security protocols long after their bodies could no longer support that threat. Vulnerability did not erase reputation, but it did complicate survival. For some, aging brought relief. They were no longer expected to assert dominance. For others, it brought fear. Weakness, real or perceived, altered how others responded. The slow erosion of reputation. Reputation inside Leavenworth was powerful, but fragile. It required constant reinforcement. Presence mattered. Engagement mattered. Silence could be strategic, but too much silence led to irrelevance. As years passed, many influential inmates lost the ability or desire to maintain their status. Younger inmates arrived with different priorities. Old alliances weakened. The memory of past authority faded. Influence eroded quietly. There were no announcements. No challenges. No dramatic confrontations. Just absence. When power becomes a burden. For inmates who built their identity around authority, decline was psychologically difficult. Some struggled to let go of control, attempting to enforce expectations that no longer held weight. This often drew attention, something Leavenworth punished quickly. Others adapted. They reduced visibility. Limited interaction. Focused on routine rather than influence. These inmates survived longer, not because they were powerful, but because they understood when power no longer served them. Leavenworth rewarded adaptation over pride. Health, illness, and institutional reality. As inmates aged, health issues became central to daily life. Medical appointments increased. Mobility decreased. Dependence on institutional care grew. This shift altered social dynamics. Inmates who once commanded respect now required assistance. The transition was often humiliating. Dignity became harder to preserve under constant observation. The institution responded clinically. Care was provided. Risk was managed. But sentiment played no role. Leavenworth addressed decline administratively, not emotionally. Isolation in later years. Isolation took on a different meaning over time. For younger inmates, segregation was punishment or strategy. For older inmates, isolation often became default. Social circles shrank. Conversations diminished. Familiar faces disappeared through transfer, release, or death. Loneliness became common. In a prison built on control, isolation was not always imposed, it emerged naturally as relevance faded. The myth of the final reckoning. Popular narratives suggest that prison power ends in dramatic confrontation, a challenge, a fall, a violent reckoning. At Leavenworth, this was rare. Most influence ended quietly. A man stopped being consulted, stopped being acknowledged, stopped being watched, and eventually stopped mattering. This quiet ending was often harder to endure than a dramatic one. Transfers, decline, and disappearance. Some inmates were eventually transferred to lower security facilities, medical institutions, or other federal prisons. These moves often reflected decline rather than progress. Transfer stripped away remaining influence. New environments did not recognize old reputations. Networks did not follow. Status reset. For others, Leavenworth became the final stop. Time ended not with release, but with permanence. Staff perspective on long-term inmates. Correctional staff witnessed these changes repeatedly. They saw inmates arrive strong, confident, and influential, only to age into quiet compliance. Officers recognized patterns. They knew which inmates would adapt and which would struggle. From the institution's perspective, this decline was expected. Leavenworth was designed to outlast individuals. What survival looked like in the end. For long-term inmates, survival eventually became about peace rather than power. Routine replaced ambition. Stability replaced dominance. Many focused on small, controllable aspects of life, reading, writing, quiet movement. These inmates were not leaders. They were not feared. But they endured. And in Leavenworth, endurance was a form of victory. The final lesson of Leavenworth. Leavenworth taught the same lesson repeatedly, across generations of inmates. Power was temporary. Reputation was fragile. Time was undefeated. Those who understood this early survived with fewer scars. Those who resisted it often suffered longer than necessary. The prison did not need to break men aggressively. It waited. Closing reflection. Inside Leavenworth Prison, influence rose and fell, gangs adapted and dissolved, and reputations faded into memory. But the institution remained unchanged, steady, controlled, and patient. Leavenworth did not erase power. It exhausted it. And for those who spent their lives inside its walls, time, not violence, was the final authority.